Water was already at his knees when the lights went out. Monitors died. Ventilators beeped once, then went silent. Somewhere above him, on the 11th floor, a room full of executives started screaming in the dark. Jake Morales jammed his shoulder into the swollen steel door of the electrical room, feeling it shudder against rising floodwater. The air smelled like salt, hot metal, and burned plastic. His flashlight beam hit the main switchgear half-submerged cables, hissing and popping like angry snakes. "Do not touch that breaker," a voice barked over the radio. "Administration says we keep power on no matter what. We've got donors in the conference center." A fresh surge of water crashed in from the stairwell, icy around his legs. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried, thin and high, cutting through the alarms. Jake looked at the glowing red handle that fed power to half of Galveston Memorial Hospital, and then at the water line creeping higher. Above him, a woman pounded on a stuck stairwell door and yelled for help, the same woman whose signature was printed on every cost-cutting memo he'd read for a month. Jake wrapped his burned hand in his shirt, braced his feet, and closed his eyes for half a second. Then he grabbed the breaker and yanked it down. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world. This whole mess started 3 weeks before that storm ever touched the Texas coast. Back then, Jake Morales was just the night electrician, the guy nobody noticed unless a light went out. 37 years old, divorced, living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from the hospital, so he could be close to both his job and his 8-year-old son, Eli. By day, he packed lunchboxes, checked homework, and fixed whatever was broken in their building for a little extra rent off the books. By night, he walked the bowels of Galveston Memorial, listening to the hum of transformers and the rattle of air handlers like they were old friends. He'd done bigger things once: Navy ships, combat zones, power systems that could light up a small city. Then a deployment went sideways, and he came home with scars on his hands and a promise in his chest: no more headlines, no more heroics. Just keep people safe quietly. Make sure the lights stay on, especially where it matters most: ICUs, NICUs, operating rooms where somebody else's family is praying in plastic chairs. Eli thought his dad was a superhero anyway. The kid built little cardboard neighborhoods on their coffee table, ran tiny copper wires under the streets, and grinned every time Jake helped him make a light bulb glow. On the fridge, he'd taped a crayon drawing of a lighthouse standing against big blue waves, 4 block letters underneath in crooked handwriting: "Light winds dark." Jake looked at that drawing every time he headed out for his shift. He believed in stuff most people laughed at. Doing a job right even if nobody said thank you. Fixing things before they broke. Writing up safety reports in plain English, even when it meant more paperwork. He'd file them follow-up and watch them disappear into some digital void, while the same rusty panels kept humming away in the bowels of the hospital. Then, one Monday night, he logged into the system and saw the new memo. Operational realignment. Night facilities staff reductions. A list of positions scrolled down the screen. Fewer techs. No second electrician on overnights. Most maintenance checks shifted to daytime to improve efficiency. The email was signed by a name he'd never heard spoken out loud, yet just seen on glossy posters in the lobby: Charlotte Ames, CEO, Silverline Health System. He swallowed hard, clicked over to his service tickets, and opened the one that really kept him up at night: main switchgear B, corrosion evidence of seawater intrusion, recommend replacement before hurricane season. Status deferred. Note from administration: reevaluate next fiscal year. That same night, as he walked past the humming cabinets that fed power to the ICU, he saw a fresh line of rust bleeding down the side of the panel. That was the moment the conflict really began, when Jake realized that the people talking about efficiency from the top floors were planning to cut the very hands that kept the place alive, while the one piece of equipment that could turn the hospital into a dark drowning box was being told to wait until next fiscal year. The morning after that memo, Jake walked into facilities and felt the shift in the air before anyone even spoke. Conversations stopped when he passed. Papers shuffled too fast. Someone pretended to type, but wasn't hitting any keys. It wasn't the usual night shift tiredness. This was the kind of hush that comes right before a cut drops, and everyone wonders who's on the chopping block. The day supervisor, Dan Hollister, waited by the bulletin board with a clipboard tucked under one arm, like a badge of authority he hadn't earned. He was younger than Jake by at least a decade, had never worked a hurricane season, and treated the place like a stepping stone to an administrative job. Dan tapped the board with his pen. Reassignments for the next 30 days. New efficiency measures. The pages were filled with red arrows, crossed out lines, and half the night crew's hours slashed in the margins. Jake found his name halfway down electrical inspection rounds reduced to twice per shift. Switchgear checks moved to as needed. Backup generator testing assigned to an apprentice who'd been here all of 6 weeks. Dan spoke loudly enough for the few day shift techs lingering around to hear. Jake, we all know you've been thorough, he said, pausing as if searching for a polite word and settling on something that sounded like barely concealed annoyance. But we've got to streamline. Administration wants less duplication, less over-maintenance. Jake felt the words thud in his chest, a mixture of disbelief and anger he tried to swallow. He kept his voice level. That switchgear is rusting through the housing. Twice per shift walkthroughs aren't enough. That's how we lose power. Dan smiled the kind of smile that said he'd planned this conversation before Jake even walked in. Every department is cutting back. We're all tightening the belt. Just follow the sheet. A few techs drifted away, not wanting any part of the tension. But one lingered, Marcia, a veteran HVAC tech, with 30 years in the building. Her expression said she agreed with Jake, but couldn't afford to get involved. She gave him a subtle shake of the head, then walked off. Jake folded the paper carefully, tucked it in his pocket, and left the room before he said something he'd regret. As he stepped into the stairwell, the hum of the building swallowed him. The elevators clanked. Air handlers thrummed. The emergency lighting flickered once like a tired heartbeat. A whole hospital relying on equipment someone thought was too expensive to replace. He made his first inspection round anyway, even if the new schedule said he didn't need to. Habit. Duty. The simple math of knowing that if he didn't, no one would. The main electrical corridor smelled faintly of salt. He crouched beside the switchgear panel, running a finger along the seam. The rust line had grown, a faint moisture sheen. He wiped it with a rag and held it under the light brownish streaks diluted by something clear. Not good. Jake logged the reading, snapped a photo, and filed another safety ticket. He knew exactly how it would go. It would get flagged, forwarded marked, awaiting review, then quietly buried until someone higher up decided it wasn't mission critical. But he submitted it anyway and moved on. By the time he clocked out the next morning, his stomach ached with frustration. He picked up Eli from school trying to shift gears. The kid ran toward him, backpack bouncing, face lit up. Dad. My lighthouse project got picked for the showcase. Jake smiled genuinely this time. Yeah, that's my guy. Eli held up a small cardboard lighthouse he'd made complete with tiny windows, cut unevenly but proudly. It spins, he said, twisting the base. And when the power goes out, I'm gonna make a bigger one that can shine all the way to the ocean. Jake ruffled his hair. You just might. They spent the evening making grilled cheese and trying out different bulb sizes on the lighthouse until they blew a fuse in the living room. Jake reset it and laughed when Eli groaned. Dad, you always fix it too fast. I want to learn. For a while, the tension from work faded. But after Eli went to bed, Jake stared at the apartment wall long after midnight. He pictured the rust streak, the memo, the reduced hours, the list with names crossed out. He remembered a night years ago on a carrier half a world away when a corroded panel almost took out auxiliary power mid-flight ops. They'd found the fault just in time. He'd written a 14-page report afterward. Only half of it ever made it into the maintenance manual. The other half had been dismissed as unlikely scenarios. He knew better than to trust unlikely. 3 days later, the disrespect went from quiet policy to something sharper. He was walking through the loading dock when he heard raised voices behind the door to supply management. He would have kept going, but his own name stopped him cold. Morales is milking the system. A man said Tom Grisham, the procurement manager. Night guys like him file 3 times the safety tickets we used to. Makes us look understaffed. Ames wants numbers cleaner, tighter. A woman answered someone from administration Jake didn't recognize. He's one of the names flagged for reassignment if this continues. He files too many incident requests. We need compliance, not constant alarms. Jake leaned against the wall, jaw clenching. Compliance. Alarms. They said those words like he was a nuisance, not a guy trying to keep the hospital alive during a storm. He stepped back silently and walked out, chest burning. When he picked up Eli that afternoon, the boy climbed into the truck with red eyes. Jake killed the engine immediately. "Hey, what's going on?" Eli sniffed, shook his head, and pulled the hood of his sweatshirt tight. Some kids were saying stuff. About what? He didn't answer, just held out a wrinkled flyer. It was for the school's parent career day. Someone had scribbled over it in pencil, "Don't bring your dad. Fixing light bulbs isn't a real job." Jake's breath caught, not because some kid had been cruel, but because Eli had cared. He pulled his son close. "Listen to me. What I do matters, and what you do one day will matter too. Don't let someone else tell you otherwise." Eli nodded against his chest. But he was quiet the whole ride home. Later that night, Jake couldn't stop replaying that moment. He'd grown used to the disrespect from higher floors, but seeing it reach Eli, that cut deeper than any memo. The whole point of Jake taking the quieter job had been to protect his kid, to give him a life without chaos. And now that life was being chipped away by people who had never seen a panel spark or held a wrench in a flooded shaft. By the end of the week, tension had built into something sharp. Dan cornered him near the ICU junction box, holding another clipboard. "Upper management is watching ticket volume," Dan said with forced patience. "Your name is flagged again. You're making us look reactive." Jake wiped sweat from his brow. "The ICU transfer switch is overheating. It tripped twice last night. I'm not ignoring that." Dan exhaled dramatically. "Then write it differently. Phrase it as a suggestion. You don't always need to pull the alarm." Jake stared at him. "When something's wrong, the alarm gets pulled. That's the job." Dan gave a tight smile. Maybe it was the job. Things change. Something in Jake's chest went cold. He'd seen this pattern before in the military, in civilian life, in any system where numbers mattered more than people. They pushed and pushed until someone finally broke, and then they blamed that person for not being a team player. That night during rounds, he walked past the pediatric wing. A little girl waved at him through a window V-pole beside her, a stuffed bear tucked under one arm. He waved back, and she smiled. He thought about the panel humming down the hall. The rust, the water, the neglected warnings. He thought about how many people in this building had no idea their lives depended on maintenance requests buried in email chains. And then, as if to confirm every worst fear, Jake found something new. A puddle. Small, but unmistakable. fresh water pooling directly under switchgear B, seeping from the concrete seam. He crouched, touched it, smelled. It tasted salt on the air. Seawater intrusion. Again. Worse than before. He logged it, submitted another urgent ticket, took photos, and left a voicemail for every senior tech still awake. Then he shut his eyes, hands braced on his knees, trying not to imagine what would happen if that panel shorted during a storm, or even a high-load night. When he returned to the office, Dan was there, arms crossed, expression tight. "We got your ticket. Administration wants to know why you keep escalating these same issues. They're saying this is borderline insubordination now." Jake's voice came out quieter than he expected. "There's water coming through the wall. That panel is failing. If it arcs, we lose half the hospital." Dan stepped closer. "You need to stop making things sound catastrophic. The new system doesn't allow for over-reporting." Jake looked at him steadily. "There is no such thing as over-reporting when lives depend on power." Dan scoffed. "You're scaring people. And you're making us look bad. I'll expect a revised report by morning. Something more measured. As if truth needed soft edges." Jake walked out before he said something he couldn't take back, storming through the automatic doors into the thick, humid night. The Gulf breeze carried the scent of distant rain, sharp electric. He tilted his head up, watching clouds churn over the water. Storm season was coming early, and the building was nowhere near ready. He sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his breath. For the first time since his Navy days, he felt something he hated, a flicker of fear. Not for himself, for the people sleeping in those rooms above him, for the tiny girl with the IV pole, for the parents in the waiting area, for Eli, who believed his dad could fix anything. He pulled out the folded memo from his pocket. Read it again. Night facilities, staff reductions. Then he unfolded the picture Eli had drawn. The lighthouse, the blue waves, the words that had become their inside promise. Light wins dark. He pressed it against the steering wheel and shut his eyes. Something big was coming. He could feel it in the air and the water pooling under the switchgear, in the tightening indifference of administrators who talked about efficiency while ignoring danger. The storm would hit. And when it did, the whole place would depend on the man they were trying to silence. Lightning spidered across the Gulf, like someone tearing open the sky. Jake saw it from the hospital rooftop as he checked the exterior conduits one last unofficial sweep before the worst of the storm made landfall. Wind hammered the building hard enough to rattle the HVAC units. The air tasted metallic. Storm surge sirens wailed across the island. It was coming. He jogged downstairs, water already blowing sideways under the emergency doors. The floors glistened with wet footprints and dragged mop streaks. Nurses were rushing between stations. Voices crackled across radio's ICU, moving to emergency power prep. NICU securing warmers. Security coordinating last-minute evacuations. Jake reached the main facilities office just as the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then steadied. Dan looked up from his desk, pale. "Transformers are getting hit. We might lose the grid." Jake didn't answer. He was already moving toward the stairwell. Dan followed him, voice cracking. "Hey, we're supposed to monitor from the office. Administration says no one goes near the main switchgear until the storm passes." Jake stopped one hand on the rail and faced him. Rain pounded the roof. Thunder rolled through the concrete beneath their feet. "There's seawater in that room," Jake said. If we lose the grid and the auto transfer doesn't fire clean, that panel could short out. That's half the hospital. Dan hesitated. We have safety protocols. We have paper, Jake snapped. We don't have time. He pushed through the stairwell door and took the steps 2 at a time. Dan didn't follow. As he descended, radio chatter escalated. Code yellow, code orange, forecast updates. Rising water levels on the first floor. Reports of wind-driven leaks near the south entrance. Then a voice he didn't recognize broke through the static, tight-controlled, but laced with tension. This is Charlotte Ames. All department leads report status. I need confirmation that emergency power is secured. The CEO, on site, probably trapped here like everyone else. Jake kept moving. When he reached the basement, the lights flickered again, longer this time, like a stalling heartbeat. He could feel the building inhale before the exhale that meant total darkness. He rounded the corner toward the electrical wing. Water pooled along the concrete floor. Not much, half an inch maybe, but moving in a slow ripple as more seeped under the exterior wall. The humidity hit him first, then the smell. Salt, metal, burning insulation. The switchgear room door was closed, but a faint glow leaked from underneath tiny flashes of blue-white arcing like lightning under water. His stomach dropped. He approached slowly, keeping to the dry patches. A loud pop echoed from inside. The lights overhead dimmed to a ghostly brown. Jake pressed his palm against the switchgear door. It trembled softly, not from wind, from electricity tracking through metal. He whispered under his breath, "Not yet. Not today." He pulled back, scanning the hallway for supplies. A rubber mat was looped over a housekeeping cart. He unrolled it and shoved it against the base of the door to slow the water creeping inside. Then he grabbed a pair of thick rubber gloves from the emergency kit mounted on the wall. They were old, stiff, but better than nothing. His radio crackled. All units grid failure in 30 seconds or less. Prepare for loss of power. Jake froze. 30 seconds. He looked at the door again, knowing exactly what that meant. When the grid dropped, the auto transfer switch had to flip cleanly to bring the generators online. But the rusted panel, soaked in seawater, was already grounding itself. If the transfer switch arced or failed altogether, the hospital would go black. And the generators wouldn't connect. The ICU, NICU, operating rooms. People would die. He swallowed hard. Memories slammed into him, nights at sea. Alarms, blaring sparks, jumping across metal, the face of a friend he'd carried out of a smoke-filled engine room, the promise he'd made afterward, never again let a preventable failure take someone. Lightning flashed somewhere above ground. 10 seconds. Jake braced himself, wrapped his gloved hand in rubber, and unlatched the door. A wall of heat hit him first. Then light, violent arcs snapping across the surface of the corroded switchgear. Water hissed and steamed on contact. The panel's main bus bar glowed a dangerous orange. He stepped inside anyway. The floor was slick, humming faintly with stray current. His boots were insulated, but not for this. Each step felt like walking through the mouth of a live power line. He scanned the panel. The transfer switch was on the far end, completely exposed to the rising water. Sparks jumped from the casing to the wet floor in short, angry bursts. The pressure gauge on the backup generator feed line was vibrating. 5 seconds. His throat tightened. Eli, hold on, buddy. He ran. Every instinct screamed for him to stop, every survival reflex he'd trained into himself in the Navy. But he ignored them all. His son's drawing flashed in his mind. Lighthouse, waves, 4 crooked letters. Light wins dark. He reached the panel and shoved his shoulder against it to keep it from blowing outward. He grabbed the manual override lever with both hands. Heat seared through the gloves instantly. His teeth clenched. "One," he whispered. The grid failed. The building went silent for a fraction of a breath, an awful, suffocating pause. Then all hell broke loose. The transfer switch sparked like a bomb fuse catching. Arcs shot out, cracking against the metal walls. Jake pulled with everything he had, muscles straining, boots slipping on wet concrete. Electricity roared through the air like a living thing. The lever moved half an inch, another. His vision narrowed. Pain shot up both arms. "Come on," he shouted, voice echoing in the room like a command. The lever slammed down. For one terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then a mechanical thunk. A roar of generators rumbling to life, lights flaring bright across the hospital. The power came back, and with it, a deafening silence in Jake's chest as he sagged against the panel, breathing in shallow gulps. His radio erupted. "Emergency power is active. We're stable. ICU holding steady, ventilators are back online, NICU confirming no losses." And then, whoever engaged the manual override report immediately. Jake leaned his forehead against the warm metal eyes squeezed shut. His hands were numb. His gloves were scorched. His whole body trembled. He stumbled out of the room. The hallway was filled with people, nurses, techs, security running in coordinated chaos. A few stopped dead when they saw him soaked, smoking, slightly gloves blackened. Marcia from HVAC put a hand to her mouth. "Jake, what did you do?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. A cluster of administrators rounded the corner next Tom from procurement, 2 directors, a couple of people in suits, all pale and wide-eyed. But at the front of them stood Charlotte Ames, wearing jeans, a rain jacket, hair pulled back, eyes sharp and searching. When she saw him, she froze. Her gaze dropped to his burned gloves, his soaked uniform, the scorch marks on the floor behind him. Then her eyes lifted back to his face. "You," she said softly. "You brought the power back." Jake swallowed, throat raw. Transfer switch failed. "Seawater intrusion. Had to pull it manually." One of the directors sputtered. "That room is a hazard zone. You could have been killed." Jake's voice was steady. "People upstairs would have died if I didn't." Charlotte stepped closer. The storm sirens wailed outside. The fluorescent lights flickered but held. Nurses ran past with crash carts calling out room numbers. But she didn't move. In that narrow corridor with water creeping across the floor and thunder cracking overhead, something shifted in her expression. Something he didn't expect. Respect. Shock. And beneath it, guilt. Footsteps echoed behind them. Dan appeared at the top of the stairs, face-flushed eyes darting from Jake to the administrators. I told him not to go in," he stammered. "He disobeyed direct." Charlotte held up a hand. Dan went silent. She looked around at the faces staring at Jake, the nurses who'd almost lost patience, the orderlies who now understood exactly how close the hospital had come to catastrophe, the techs who'd known all along something was wrong. Then she spoke, voice calm but ringing through the hallway. "He saved this hospital." No one argued, not even Dan. Jake leaned against the wall, exhausted, water dripping from his sleeves. Every muscle shook, but he was upright, breathing, alive. A nurse approached a young man from the ICU, whose name Jake didn't know. His eyes were glassy. "My patient. I almost lost him when the vents dropped. If they hadn't come back when they did." He swallowed hard. "Thank you." Jake nodded, unable to speak. Charlotte stepped closer, lowering her voice. "We need to talk," she said. "All of us." But before he could answer, another thunderous boom shook the building closer this time, rattling pipes overhead. A second surge was coming, and the hospital was still sitting on a flooded basement. Jake straightened slowly, pain shooting down his arm but determination tightening in his chest. The storm wasn't done, and neither was he. The lights steadied, humming with the low, even pulse of the generators. For a moment, the hospital existed in a strange, suspended silence, like the whole building was holding its breath after nearly drowning. Staff stood frozen in the corridor, listening, waiting, afraid to believe the danger had actually passed. Jake pushed his palm against the wall to stay upright. His uniform clung to him, soaked through. His gloves were ruined fingertips melted into distorted lumps. His skin burned beneath them. He wasn't sure if the shaking in his hands was from pain adrenaline or everything he'd just risked. A nurse knelt beside a patient on a gurney, the wheels dripping rainwater. "Ventilator's stable," she whispered into her radio. A second nurse pressed a hand over her heart, whispering a prayer of thanks. A security guard wiped his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Even the older techs, people who'd seen hurricanes rip roofs off and flood tunnels to the ceiling, looked unnerved by how close they'd come. And all of them kept glancing at Jake. Not with suspicion. Not with annoyance. With fear, awe, and something that looked uncomfortably close to reverence. A young orderly finally broke the spell. He stepped forward, voice cracking. "Morales, how did you even know what to do in there?" Jake didn't answer right away. His brain felt fogged, each thought pushing through static. "I didn't," he murmured. "I just did what had to be done." But the orderly kept staring at him like he'd stepped out of a legend instead of a flooded basement. Charlotte Ames stood 10 feet away, perfectly still, her rain jacket plastered to her shoulders. Water dripped from the ends of her hair. Her jaw was clenched, eyes locked on Jake with intense, almost surgical focus. "You didn't just do what had to be done," she said quietly. "You saved lives. This hospital owes you." A second explosion of thunder cut her off, rattling the fixtures overhead. Dust drifted from the ceiling like shaken snow. Somewhere above them, an alarm started chirping angrily, then died. People flinched, ducked instinctively, bracing for another failure. Jake lifted his head. That came from the emergency stairwell shaft. Charlotte's expression pinched in concern. "Is that a structural issue?" "No," Jake said. "That's the generators under load. That boom was a pressure release. The bearings on one of them are failing." He didn't know how he knew. He just knew. The sound pattern etched itself across his ears the way language did for someone who grew up bilingual. Marcia, the senior HVAC tech, stared at him slowly. Jake. That sound was barely audible. "How did you—" He pushed past the wall, trying to breathe through the ache in his arms. He didn't want to answer. He'd spent years making sure no one asked in the first place. But everyone waited. Even Charlotte. And something inside him, exhaustion, honesty, or the simple fact that he almost died tonight, unlocked the truth before he could hide it again. "I've heard it before," he said. On a destroyer-class generator room, when the seals start to go under stress, you hear that exact tremor right before the temperatures spike. A hush fell over the hall. Dan took a hesitant step forward. You were Navy." Jake nodded once. 13 years. Electrical division. Engine room tech first class. Even the building seemed to go quiet, as if the pipes and ducts wanted to hear him too. "You worked on combat generators?" Marcia asked. Jake swallowed. "That and the emergency power systems. I taught troubleshooting. Led response units. We kept ships alive in waters where a blackout meant you didn't come home." A ripple of murmurs spread through the group. Dan looked like he'd swallowed an ice cube. Tom from procurement stared at the floor, embarrassed. Even the administrators who'd whispered about over-reporting now wore looks of dawning horror and regret. The orderly who'd spoken earlier whispered, "So you're the reason we didn't lose anyone in the ICU." Jake shook his head, voice hoarse. "I'm the reason I had to do my old job again tonight. I filed warnings. I begged for repairs. I gave every sign something was wrong. I didn't want this storm to prove me right." After a long moment, Charlotte stepped closer, each footstep slow, deliberate. She stopped in front of him, studying him like she'd never really seen him before. "You trained emergency power teams for the Navy," she said slowly. "And you've been working here, with no one knowing." "My resume didn't matter," Jake said. "Not after I left the service. Not after everything it cost me." Her brow furrowed. "Cost you?" Jake exhaled through his nose. He wasn't a man who shared easily, but tonight had stripped him down to raw nerve. He looked at the faces around him, fearful, hopeful, humbled, and finally let the words come. "My team was hit during an engine room fire," he said. "We lost 2 sailors. One was 21. A kid. I got the rest out, but I still hear it, the alarms, the metal rupturing, the silence after." He swallowed hard. "After that, I promised myself I'd never let a preventable failure take another life. Not under my watch, not anywhere. So I walked away from promotions. I took a quieter life, a safer life, one where I could raise my son and keep power running for people who rely on it." Charlotte's face softened with something deeper than sympathy, understanding maybe. "I didn't want heroics," Jake continued. "I wanted stability. I wanted to fix small things before they became big ones. I wanted to stay invisible and useful." He looked around the room. "But the only way to stay invisible tonight would have been to let people die." No one spoke. Not Dan. Not Tom. Not the directors who had once dismissed him as a liability. Charlotte was the first to move. She straightened shoulders, pulling back with purpose. Her voice carried the steady force of someone who'd made thousands of decisions, but never one like this. "Everyone in this hallway needs to hear this," she said. "If Jake hadn't acted, if he hadn't used knowledge none of us even knew he had, we'd be handing out body bags right now." The director of clinical operations closed her eyes, visibly shaken. A surgical nurse covered her mouth with her hand. Even the security guard looked away, blinking rapidly. Charlotte turned toward the administrators. "You questioned his reports," she said. "You called them overreactions. You flagged him for reassignment. You were wrong." The words echoed across the corridor, unmistakable, unsoftened, deliberate. Tom flushed crimson. We didn't understand the severity." "You didn't ask," Charlotte said. "You assumed. You dismissed expertise because it didn't fit cleanly into a spreadsheet." She faced Jake again. "You filed warnings. You documented issues. You tried to prevent this, and we ignored you." Her expression tightened painfully. "I ignored you." Jake stared at her. "I don't need apologies." "No," she said. "You need authority." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Charlotte's voice carried over it all. "When the storm ends, I'm establishing a new position, Emergency Power and Safety Systems Lead. Someone who has the authority to override procurement decisions. Someone who can shut down operations when needed. Someone who answers directly to me." Jake blinked, stunned. He opened his mouth, but she lifted a hand, stopping him. "You're the only person in this hospital who has proven twice tonight that you can recognize danger before the rest of us even feel the tremor. We need that. I need that." Dan stepped forward suddenly, desperation tinging his voice. "Ma'am, if I may." Jake doesn't have a degree, and Charlotte cut him off with a cold look. "He has something better than a degree. He has experience under pressure that none of us can match." Dan's cheeks drained of color. "But," My understanding was that I'd be moving up in. You'll stay exactly where you are, she said. And you'll work under him. The power shift was palpable, like the whole corridor rebalanced itself around a single truth. Jake wasn't invisible. He wasn't expendable. He wasn't a night shift nobody. He was the man who kept the lights on. Charlotte took a breath, lowering her voice so only he could hear. This wasn't just a storm, she said. It exposed every weakness in our systems and in our judgment. When this is over, I want you to help me rebuild. Not patch. Rebuild. Jake felt the weight of those words settle on him, heavy, real, but not unwelcome. I'll think about it, he said quietly. You'll have time, she replied. But not too much, because the next storm won't wait, and neither can we. Before he could respond, another burst of thunder rattled the glass doors at the far end of the hallway. The lights flickered only once, but enough to make everyone flinch. Charlotte drew in a sharp breath. What was that? Jake listened. A hum, a vibration underfoot, a rhythm he didn't like. The second generator, he said. It's straining. Her eyes widened. Will it fail? Jake straightened his burned shoulders. Not if I get to it first. The crowd parted instinctively, clearing a path for him, and as he stepped forward toward the next danger, toward whatever came next, every face turned with a single undeniable expression. He was the one they trusted, the one they needed. And for the first time in years, Jake felt something he hadn't expected to feel tonight. Purpose. The second surge never came. The backup generator held humming back into a steady rhythm as the storm finally ran out of fury. For the first time in hours, the building felt still, not calm. Not yet, but steady enough for everyone to breathe again. By dawn, the rain had faded into a dull patter. Staff stepped outside into a parking lot filled with seaweed and broken tree branches blinking into the pale morning light. No one left without passing Jake first, not because he asked for it, but because word had already traveled through every hallway and ward. Nurses hugged him, orderlies shook his hand. A surgeon clapped him on the shoulder and said, "We kept 3 people alive last night because of you." Even the janitorial crew people who often worked in the same shadows he did, walked by with quiet nods of respect, the kind men give each other when words feel too small. Dan avoided him for an hour, circling the edges of the crowd. Finally, he approached with his eyes lowered. "I misjudged you," he said, voice rough. "And I let the wrong people influence my decisions. I'm sorry, Morales." Jake watched him for a long moment, then nodded once. "We all learned something last night. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a place to start." Charlotte Ames stood a few steps away, arms crossed, lightly watching the way staff gravitated toward him. When their eyes met, she walked over with the solemnity of someone who knew the next words would matter. "You saved this place twice," she said. "Not just the building, the people, the trust, everything we'd taken for granted. And I won't let that be forgotten." He shrugged, though his chest tightened at the sincerity in her voice. "I just did my job." "No," she said softly. "You did more than a job. And we're going to build something better because of it." They spoke for nearly an hour about the panel, about his warnings, about what needed to change. Charlotte didn't lecture or defend. She listened. Really listened. When she finally left to meet with the board, Jake realized he'd never seen an executive look so humbled and determined at the same time. By the end of the week, consequences arrived. Procurement practices were frozen pending review. New oversight committees were created. Safety tickets, every one of them, were pulled up from the digital graveyard and re-examined. And Charlotte called an all-hands meeting where she publicly acknowledged the failures that nearly cost lives. She didn't hide behind memos or excuses. She pointed to Jake and said, "This man showed more leadership in a flooded basement than some of us have shown in an entire career." Her voice didn't shake. Neither did the room. 3 weeks later, Jake officially accepted the role she'd offered emergency power and safety systems lead. It wasn't a flashy position, but it was the kind that made a difference. His badge changed. His authority changed. And for the first time since he left the Navy, the work he did matched the responsibility he carried inside. He still walked his old night corridors, though carrying a tablet, not a flashlight. He still checked on the panels and the conduits and the emergency batteries. Only now the younger techs followed him, like an informal patrol, listening as he explained why certain pipes hummed louder before a fault, and why some switches needed to be coaxed, not forced. They called him Chief. He never told them to stop. Eli noticed the change first. "You smile more when you come home," he said one night over spaghetti. "And you stand different, like you're taller." Jake laughed quietly, ruffling his son's hair. "Maybe I finally figured out where I'm supposed to be." Eli nodded, like he understood everything. He probably did. Kids see things adults overlook. Months passed. Hurricane season ended without another close call. The hospital installed new switchgear, top-of-the-line equipment Jake had personally selected. Charlotte pushed through a new emergency response protocol based on his guidance, and the state regulators wrote up Galveston Memorial as a model for coastal preparedness. But some of the changes were smaller, quieter. Nurses began sending him Christmas cards. The ICU team showed up one night with cupcakes that said, "Thanks for the lights." Dan learned to defer instead of dictate. And every shift, someone taped a fresh note on the break room wall. If something's wrong, Morales sees it first. One warm spring evening, Jake and Eli stood outside on their apartment balcony, a homemade lighthouse glowing on the railing, the newest version of Eli's project. The bulb cast a soft circle of light across the dark courtyard. Eli leaned against him. "You think storms will still be scary? Storms will always be storms," Jake said. "But we're better at facing them now." Eli nodded, watching the lighthouse rotate. "Light wins dark," he said. Jake smiled. "Yeah, it does." Across the bay, the hospital windows glowed in a steady, even grid. No flickers, no shadows, no signs of the failures that once hid in its walls. It looked for the first time like a place built to outlast any storm. Jake Morales had never wanted to be anyone's hero. He just wanted to keep people safe. But life has a way of lifting quiet men into loud moments, and sometimes the person who spends years in the dark ends up being the only one who knows how to bring the light back. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this: heroes don't appear when things are easy. Heroes are revealed when everything breaks at once, and someone decides to stand their ground anyway.